It was just another typical morning at the Elite Motors dealership. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, but no one noticed the elderly man who stepped inside. His boots, well worn from years of service, clicked softly on the polished tile floor. George Miller, 72, had walked into this world of polished chrome and luxury cars with a quiet purpose. But despite the gleaming SUVs and high-end sedans on display, no one acknowledged him. He wasn't here for the glitzy allure that others sought. He wasn't here for the designer suits or the showroom's glossy image. George had walked in with nothing but a need, a reliable, used car that would take him to and from the VA hospital. As he moved deeper into the showroom, his every step felt weighted with time. His flannel shirt and faded jeans, his rough hands that had once held a rifle instead of a pen, were dismissed with a glance. A young salesman, Jeremy, looked up from his phone, only to glance back down without a word. The receptionist, a bright-eyed young woman named Lisa, didn't even lift her gaze from her nails, tapping rhythmically as if nothing unusual was happening. George walked past them all, his gaze focused, unwavering. He didn't care for their attention. He wasn't interested in small talk or the fake smiles people wore like masks. All he wanted was a car. But as he sat in the quiet corner, waiting patiently, the world around him hummed, oblivious to the man sitting in its midst. He wasn't invisible to himself, though. His eyes wandered briefly to the window, and he could almost see the battlefields of his past flashing in the reflection. A quiet warrior, his dignity unspoken but unwavering. George Miller sat quietly in the corner of Elite Motors, his back straight but slightly weary. He was a man of few words, a man whose life had been shaped by years of discipline and duty. His eyes, though tired, still carried the weight of the world, a world he'd once fought for with everything he had. And now he sat waiting. Waiting for something simple, nothing more than a car, a reliable one, to get him to the VA hospital. But in a world so obsessed with appearances, George knew that his simple request would be overlooked, just as he was. The dealership around him buzzed with the hum of salespeople gossiping, the soft rattle of coffee cups being stirred, and the laughter of a couple examining a sleek sedan. A few young men in tailored suits passed by him, oblivious to the older man sitting quietly in his worn boots and faded jeans. They didn't look his way, not even a glance. George wasn't in a hurry. He was used to waiting. He had waited in foxholes, under fire, in places where time was both an enemy and a friend. The showroom with its shiny vehicles and overpolished surfaces felt like a different kind of battlefield. But here there was no noise of gunfire, no sharp commands or thundering footsteps. There was only the low murmur of consumerism, a world where dignity seemed to be something for sale, not something earned. And so, George waited. Minutes passed. Then, 15 minutes, then 30. The receptionist, Lisa, still hadn't looked up from her phone. The coffee machine whirred behind her, but there was no sense of urgency in her movements. She was busy with something far more important than a tired old man. Her polished look, the sharp cut of her blazer, and the way she clicked her nails against the counter as if the world was revolving around her left George, with a sense of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something unsettling, almost dismissive. His eyes didn't move from the notebook he had pulled from his coat pocket. A small leather-bound thing, its edges frayed and worn from years of use. His fingers, rough from decades of hard work, flipped through the pages as he slowly surveyed the maps and diagrams that filled the pages. Some of the notations were tactical, old field maps from long-forgotten missions. Other pages were filled with motivational quotes he had once clung to, reminders of a life spent in service, under pressure, and in the company of men who depended on him. George paused at one particular quote. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite it." He closed the notebook briefly and looked around the showroom again. The salesmen were chatting amongst themselves, the couple discussing the features of the sedan, and the receptionist tapping away at her phone. No one seemed to notice him. But that was the way it always was. When you were older, when you had lived a life of service, you became invisible to the world around you. "Excuse me, sir." George looked up slowly. The voice was high-pitched, but there was no warmth in it. Lisa, the receptionist, stood before him now, her smile as fake as the designer heels she wore. "This area is for active buyers," she said, her tone too rehearsed, too practiced. "If you're just resting, there's a bench outside." George felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't react. He simply folded the notebook closed, careful not to tear the pages he had so lovingly written on. His fingers were steady. His voice, when it came, was calm, but there was a weight to it. "I'm here to look at a vehicle," George replied. Lisa blinked, caught off guard. She glanced at his worn boots, his flannel shirt, the edges of his scuffed belt buckle. She clearly didn't expect him to respond like that. For a moment, the hardness in her expression softened, but only for a fraction of a second. Then she straightened, crossing her arms, as if to shield herself from any further discomfort. "Well, you didn't check in," she said, her tone clipped, still polite but dismissive. "I wasn't asked to," George replied evenly, his words cutting through the air like a calm breeze before a storm. From across the showroom, a few young salesmen, Trey and Jared, watched the exchange with amusement. Jared nudged Trey, his lips curling into a smirk. "Probably here for the free AC," Jared murmured, just loud enough for George to hear. Trey snorted. "Or maybe he's lost. You think he even drives?" George remained unmoved. He wasn't surprised. In his years of service, he had encountered many who looked down on him for what they saw on the surface. But he had long learned not to care. He didn't need validation from anyone. Lisa turned slightly, her posture more rigid now, her eyes scanning him like a specimen under a microscope. "Look," she said, as if trying to soften the blow. "I don't want to be rude, but we do have a clientele standard. Maybe I can refer you to one of our budget branches." George stared at her for a moment. He didn't have to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. Finally, he closed his notebook and stood up slowly, the leather binding creaking under his touch. "I'm not here for charity," he said quietly. "I'm here for reliability. Something that starts on the first try." For a moment, Lisa seemed to hesitate. She blinked as if trying to understand his words, trying to process the calm authority in his voice. But the moment passed. She simply nodded, a polite, empty gesture, and returned to her desk. George didn't wait for her to say anything else. He sat back down, his posture unchanged. He wasn't there to fight for attention. He was there for something simple, something dependable. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world had passed him by, that the very dignity he had earned through years of service was nothing more than a distant memory to others. Inside the sales office, the laughter of the staff echoed off the walls. They were oblivious to the man sitting in the corner. Miles, the floor supervisor, leaned against the desk, sipping an energy drink as he observed the interaction from behind the tinted glass. "Did you see the boots?" he asked, chuckling. "Military issue from what? Vietnam?" Trey snorted. "I don't think that guy's seen the inside of a car dealership since cassette tapes were cutting edge." Jared joined in. "Think he even has a license? My grandpa stopped driving after 75, and that guy looks older than the Civil Rights Act." The laughter continued, casual, cruel, and dismissive. But there was one person who was different. Daniel, the young intern, sat in the corner of the office, watching quietly. He didn't laugh. Instead, something about George's presence unsettled him. The way the man sat, so still, so composed, reminded Daniel of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Someone who had already earned their place in the world and didn't need to shout for recognition. "What's he even doing out there?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice tentative. Miles shrugged. "Sketching escape routes, maybe. Old soldiers and their weird habits." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He stared at George, really looked at him, and in that moment, something clicked. He didn't see a frail old man. He saw a man who had lived a life, a man who had been through things that most couldn't even begin to imagine, and despite the way everyone else treated him, George was still standing, still dignified. "I think I'll offer him some water," Daniel said, his voice firm with a sense of doing what was right. The others laughed. "You'll scare him off," Miles scoffed. "Let him be. Let him leave." But Daniel didn't listen. His gut told him to do the right thing, and he stood up, walking over to George. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "Can I offer you some water?" George looked up at him slowly, his eyes steady, calm. For the first time in a while, he allowed himself to meet someone's gaze. He nodded just once, the smallest acknowledgement of Daniel's kindness. The silence between them was filled with something unspoken, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Daniel stepped forward and handed him the cold bottle of water. And for a brief moment, the noise of the showroom faded away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a moment of humanity in a world that seemed to have forgotten how to see people for who they truly were. George Miller sat motionless in the same corner of Elite Motors, the quiet in the showroom echoing around him like a vacuum. The constant chatter of salesmen, the hum of machines, and the clinking of coffee cups barely registered in his mind. He wasn't interested in the luxury cars surrounding him, the polished chrome, or the smell of new leather that seemed to ooze from every corner. He wasn't there for any of that. All he needed was something simple, reliable, a used car that would take him to the VA hospital and back. But in a world where superficial appearances often meant everything, George understood that he was, at best, invisible. And today it seemed that invisibility had only deepened. The receptionist, Lisa, had barely looked up from her phone when she told him the bench outside would be more appropriate for someone like him. He hadn't even been acknowledged as a customer. Her dismissive words stung, but George didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that silence could be a shield stronger than any armor. He had been to places where battles were fought without a word spoken, where a simple glance could be more deadly than 1,000 words. The salesmen had mocked him, their laughter ringing through the showroom as they ridiculed his worn boots and ancient flannel shirt. They hadn't recognized him for who he was, just another elderly man in their eyes, too old to be a serious customer. Their smirks, their jokes, their condescension, nothing had surprised him. This, too, was part of the world he now lived in. He had been there before. He had seen the cruelty of those who thought they were better than others. He had seen it in the barracks, on the battlefield, in the faces of men who had never experienced real hardship. But back then, he had fought back, had commanded respect with every action he took. Now, in a showroom, it seemed no one cared. But George wasn't looking for recognition, not today. He was just a man who had lived through wars, who had seen comrades fall, who had been part of something bigger than himself. A man whose heart had bled for his country and who had been left behind in his old age. Today, he wasn't looking for medals or accolades. He was just looking for something simple, a car that worked, something he could count on. But the world had made it clear that, to them, he was no more important than the chair he sat in, no more important than the cars they pedaled. The minutes passed slowly, 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. No one came to ask him if he needed help. No one seemed to notice the old man sitting in the corner, patiently waiting. He had learned the art of waiting a long time ago, waiting for reinforcements in a war zone, waiting for a mission to begin, waiting for the end of a long, grueling day. But now the waiting felt different. It felt as though he were waiting for something that wasn't going to come. The showroom buzzed around him, oblivious to his presence. Salesmen joked, customers examined cars, and Lisa typed furiously on her phone. No one seemed to care, but that was fine. He had learned long ago that some people weren't worth the energy it took to care about them. He had faced enemy lines, fought through jungles, and led men into battle. He had seen horrors that most couldn't even begin to fathom. And yet here he was, sitting in a showroom, treated like a shadow in the corner. Suddenly the door to the sales office opened, and a tall man stepped out. He was older than most of the others, his graying hair and wrinkled face showing the signs of a life well lived. His uniform wasn't military, but George could tell there was something about him, something that set him apart from the others. This man, unlike the rest, carried himself with an air of quiet authority. George watched him as he made his way across the showroom, his eyes catching George's. The man paused for a moment, and their gazes locked. There was something about the way the man looked at him. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't mocking. It was recognition. It was understanding. The man walked slowly over to where George sat, and without a word, he sat beside him. George could feel the air shift around them as the noise of the showroom seemed to fade away. The man's presence had an impact. People started to notice, to shift uncomfortably, to realize that something had changed in the room. "I'm General Henry Wexler," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "You may not remember me, but I certainly remember you." George's heart skipped a beat. The name was familiar. The voice was familiar. He had heard it before in the chaos of battle, in the moments when life hung in the balance, when men depended on each other to survive. Wexler had been one of those men, one of the soldiers George had fought beside in the heart of enemy territory. "General," George said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I didn't know you were here." Wexler chuckled softly. "I wasn't planning to come here today, but when I saw you sitting here, I couldn't ignore it." George looked at him, his expression unreadable. The old wounds, both physical and emotional, started to stir in him. He had lived through so much, and yet it seemed like the world had forgotten him. Like the war he had fought so fiercely for had been reduced to just another chapter in a history book that no one ever bothered to read. But Wexler remembered. He remembered George's quiet strength, his leadership, his unyielding resolve. "You saved my life," Wexler continued, "back in the Korangal Valley. I've never forgotten that." George didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what Wexler was referring to. He had carried the young soldier through enemy fire, his own wounds forgotten in the chaos of battle. He had done it without thinking, without hesitation. It was just what they did for each other. But now in a showroom, it seemed that the world had forgotten what it meant to show respect. It seemed that dignity no longer mattered unless it was attached to a price tag. Wexler stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over the showroom floor. He turned to face the rest of the room, his voice growing louder. This man you've all ignored, is a hero. He has earned more respect than any of you can fathom. He's the one who kept us alive when it mattered most." The room fell silent. The laughter, the whispers, the mocking comments, all of it stopped. Salesman froze mid-sentence, and Lisa looked up from her phone, her face pale. No one moved. No one spoke. "Do any of you know who this man is?" Wexler asked, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. Amber, the receptionist, opened her mouth but didn't speak. She had no words. None of them did. They were all too stunned, too ashamed to even try to explain themselves. Wexler's eyes locked onto George's once more, and he nodded. "This man saved my life. He led men through hell, and he asked for nothing in return. And yet here we are, in a showroom where he's treated like an afterthought." George didn't need to say anything. Wexler's words spoke for him, and in that moment, the entire showroom knew the truth. George Miller, the old man sitting in the corner, was no ordinary customer. He was a man who had lived, fought, and sacrificed more than any of them could ever understand. And in that moment, it didn't matter if they knew his story. What mattered was that they saw him for who he was, a man deserving of dignity and respect. Wexler turned to the salespeople, his gaze hardening. "From now on, you will treat every customer with the respect they deserve. No more ignoring, no more dismissing. If you fail to do that, you'll be replaced." George watched as the staff absorbed Wexler's words, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't for him. It was for the lesson that had finally been learned. And with that, the showroom that had once been a place of indifference became something else. It became a place where respect was not earned, but owed. The tension in the showroom was palpable now. General Henry Wexler stood by the door, his presence commanding every inch of space in the room. His hands were clasped in front of him, but the look in his eyes was razor sharp, cutting through the discomfort of the employees like a hot knife through butter. Across from him, George Miller sat motionless, still as ever, his eyes scanning the room with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through wars, through losses, and through a lifetime of battles most people would never understand. Wexler had spoken the truth, and there was no turning back. The salesmen who had once mocked George were now frozen in place, their smiles gone, replaced by wide eyes and stiffened spines. Amber, the receptionist who had so casually dismissed George earlier, now stood by the desk, her face pale and her fingers nervously tapping against the glass countertop. It was as if everything they had taken for granted, every small assumption, Every look of superiority had been shattered in an instant. Wexler turned slowly to the group, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. You all think you can tell who matters by the way they look, by the way they dress, by the cars they drive. But you're wrong. His voice was measured, but the weight behind each word made it clear that this was not just a lesson in customer service, it was a lesson in life. The man sitting in front of you, George Miller, doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He doesn't need to show you his medals, his commendations, or his battle scars. His dignity, his worth, have already been earned. The silence was deafening. The showroom had turned into a classroom, and Wexler was its teacher. But it wasn't the kind of lesson most of the employees had signed up for. This was a lesson in humility, in respect, and in the harsh reality that the world wasn't always as simple as the neatly labeled boxes they had put everyone into. George, for his part, remained quiet. He didn't need to say anything. He never had. In the years he had spent leading men on the battlefield, he had learned that words weren't always necessary. Sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else ever could. And in this moment, his silence was deafening. His eyes flicked briefly to Wexler, acknowledging the man who had once saved his life, but his expression never wavered. He wasn't here for this. He wasn't here for the apology or the recognition. He was here for something far more basic, something no one had yet given him: respect. Wexler glanced back at the staff, his eyes hardening. You think respect is earned by showing your best side? By flashing a smile or offering a free coffee? It's not. Respect is owed the moment someone walks through that door. You don't have to know their story. You don't have to know their past. You just have to treat them like a human being. The words struck like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. And for the first time, the employees seemed to understand what Wexler was trying to say. The veneer of casual disregard, of superiority, began to crack. Daniel, the young intern who had offered George the bottle of water earlier, stood at the edge of the showroom, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had acted out of instinct, out of a sense of what was right. He hadn't expected Wexler's words to resonate so deeply, but they had. The others, Miles, Trey, Jared, stood frozen, their previous arrogance vanishing in the wake of Wexler's sharp words. Look at this man, Wexler continued, turning back toward George. He's led men into battle. He's saved lives. He's seen things you couldn't even begin to imagine. But instead of offering him respect, you mock him. You make assumptions based on the way he looks. You assume he doesn't belong here, that he doesn't have the right to be treated with dignity. But you're wrong. George shifted slightly in his seat, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers still steady. The quiet strength he exuded was palpable, and yet in that moment, it felt as though the world had turned upside down. What had been an ordinary visit to a car dealership had become something far more significant. He wasn't just there to buy a car anymore. He was there to teach a lesson he hadn't even asked to give. Wexler turned toward the employees again, his voice lower now but no less intense. Every one of you needs to understand something. It's not about the car, it's not about the money, it's about the way you treat people. You're not selling vehicles, you're selling trust, you're selling dignity, and if you can't offer those things, then you're not in the right business. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate, but it wasn't replaced with the usual office hum. Instead, there was a stillness, a weighty silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The laughter that had once filled the showroom was gone. The mockery, the dismissive glances, all of it had evaporated in an instant. Wexler's gaze turned back to George. I've seen a lot in my life. I've seen men break under pressure. I've seen leaders fall. But you, George, Wexler said, his voice quiet but full of reverence, you never wavered. You led when it counted. You kept us going when the world wanted to tear us apart. George didn't respond, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of gratitude, a faint nod of acknowledgement. He didn't need a speech. He didn't need the recognition. But in that moment, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of a battle finally won, not with guns or strategies, but with the simple, unspoken truth of his life. Wexler turned to the rest of the staff, his voice firm. From today on, we're going to do things differently. No one walks through these doors and leaves feeling invisible. We're going to treat every customer with the respect they deserve, regardless of how they look or where they come from. No exceptions. He paused, letting his words sink in. That means you, Daniel, Wexler said, his gaze settling on the young intern. You acted like a human being today. You did what was right. You're going to help Mr. Miller find the car he needs. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected the worst, a reprimand perhaps for going against the flow. But instead, Wexler was acknowledging his kindness, his decency. For the first time that day, Daniel felt a surge of pride. It wasn't for the recognition. It was for the quiet validation of doing the right thing. Wexler turned back to George, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. George, I want you to pick out whatever you need. No charge. Anything you want. George finally spoke, his voice steady but with a hint of warmth. I didn't come here for favors, General. I just wanted something dependable. Wexler smiled again. And that's exactly why you deserve one. He turned to the staff. You'll all be attending mandatory sensitivity and ethics training. We're going to change the culture here, starting right now. The showroom staff was still silent, still absorbing the weight of Wexler's words. The air felt different, thicker somehow. The world outside was still moving, but inside it felt like a pivotal moment had just passed. No one moved, no one spoke, and in that moment, George Miller stood up, slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of the years had lifted just a little bit. He nodded at Daniel, a silent acknowledgement of the young man who had offered him a moment of kindness in a world that had forgotten how to see him. I'll take something reliable, George said quietly. And with that, the silence in the showroom was broken, not by the clink of coffee cups or the hum of sales pitches, but by the quiet understanding that dignity had been reclaimed, not demanded. The transformation that unfolded at Elite Motors over the following weeks was nothing short of extraordinary. The showroom, once filled with the casual disregard for those who didn't fit the glossy image of luxury, became a place where respect wasn't just given, it was earned and expected. General Wexler's words had struck like a thunderclap, and in their wake, a new understanding blossomed among the staff. They had been humbled, but more than that, they had been awakened to something far more important than sales quotas or polished displays. The mandatory ethics and sensitivity training, while met with initial reluctance, began to change the atmosphere. Employees started listening, not just to customers, but to each other. They learned to see beyond the surface, to recognize the dignity in every person who walked through those doors. George Miller's visit had been a catalyst, but the real change happened when the staff, especially Daniel, understood that the true value of a person wasn't tied to their appearance or their background. And as for George, he came back to the dealership a few weeks later, not for the flashy cars or the luxury, but for something simple, something reliable. When he picked up the keys to his new vehicle, the respect that had once been withheld from him had finally been returned. And that, for him, was worth more than any price tag. The story of George Miller at Elite Motors teaches us a powerful lesson about respect, dignity, and how we treat others. It reminds us that true value isn't determined by appearance, wealth, or status. Every person, regardless of their background, deserves respect the moment they walk into a room. Too often, we make assumptions based on surface-level judgments, forgetting that we all carry our own stories, some of which are far more significant than what meets the eye. George didn't ask for recognition, but he taught us that respect should never be earned after someone's story is revealed. It should be given freely from the moment they arrive. This story is a call to action, to listen more, judge less, and always treat others with the dignity they deserve. Whether it's a customer, a colleague, or even a stranger on the street, remember that respect costs nothing but can make all the difference. The next time you meet someone, don't look at them through the lens of their appearance or what they have. Instead, see them for who they truly are, someone worthy of kindness, compassion, and understanding.